Every goat the Olympic mountain goat removal program ever put a hand on left with an ear tag. The one a monitoring camera photographed in the Bailey Range on June 9, 2025, has no tag in either ear. The camera itself is a standard motion-triggered unit, part of a post-removal monitoring grid the National Park Service has kept running in the areas where the program's own records list operations as complete. This particular station sits in a subalpine basin below Mount Anderson, inside Olympic National Park, mounted to document exactly this kind of residual activity. The agency's own acknowledgement that the count was never finished. What makes this frame worth pulling out of a season of routine data is what's missing from it. A nanny goat crosses open scree in daylight, unremarkable in every way except one. No yellow ear tag, no collar, nothing marking her as an animal the program ever captured, examined, or counted. Picture the basin at that hour, bare rock still holding morning frost at 9,000 feet, clouds sitting low enough in the drainage below to erase the valley floor entirely. The kind of ceiling that grounded helicopter crews working this exact terrain on repeated days during the removal operation itself. This was not a goat that slipped its tag. Program veterinarians used livestock ear tags rated to stay attached for the life of the animal, and no untagging event was ever logged for any captured individual in this drainage. It was not a juvenile that grew past an undersized tag either. This animal's build and horn growth place it well past kid stage, old enough that it should have been alive and visible during at least one of the program's 4 capture periods. And it was not a mistaken identification of a domestic or escaped animal. Program biologists confirmed the build, coat, and horn structure against the confirmed native range profile before this file went further. The absence itself is the detail nobody on the review team has been able to explain away. Every goat the program's helicopter crews and ground volunteers ever laid hands on got tagged before release or removal. That is the one universal fact in 4 years of paperwork. An animal without a tag, alive in 2025 in a drainage the program marked complete, was never in that paperwork at all. Where that camera sits matters as much as what it caught without a tag on it. Mountain goats are not native to the Olympic Peninsula. They were introduced in the 1920s for sport hunting, and by 2018, the population in Olympic National Park and the surrounding national forest was estimated at 725 animals. Spread across alpine terrain, the species had no evolutionary business occupying in the first place. The damage to the peninsula's endemic alpine plants, some found nowhere else on Earth, was severe enough that removing the goats became formal federal policy. The Mountain Goat Management Plan was finalized in May 2018 after an environmental review process that began in 2014. Between September 2018 and October 2020, the National Park Service, Washington's Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Forest Service removed 412 goats from the peninsula in a coordinated, multi-year operation. 325 captured alive by helicopter and translocated to the Cascades, 16 kids sent to zoos, 31 taken by trained volunteers in a final ground-based lethal removal phase that ran into October 2020. It would be easy to assume a program this large and well-documented accounted for every animal on the peninsula. That assumption survives a glance at the summary numbers. It does not survive the agency's own language once the search moved into the terrain the helicopters couldn't reach. Park staff describing post-operation surveys in the roughest country as finding very few goats, or signs of goats, not zero, and never claimed as zero, in public statements issued at the close of the program. It would also be easy to assume a 5-year gap between the program's end and a fresh photograph means the record has simply gone stale, that nobody has actually been watching in the meantime. Post-removal monitoring stations, including this one, have run continuously since 2021, specifically to track exactly this kind of residual activity on a fixed retrieval schedule with no gap in coverage documented anywhere in the maintenance log. and it would be easy to assume this animal is simply an escaped domestic goat or a stray wandered in from some other herd nearby. Olympic National Park's isolation cuts both ways here. The peninsula's mountain wildlife has been separated from the mainland Cascades by lowland terrain and saltwater since the last glacial period, the same isolation responsible for species like lynx and wolverine never naturally occurring here at all. A goat this deep in the park's interior, at this elevation, did not wander in recently from anywhere else. The terrain itself explains part of why this particular peninsula produces so much footage nobody can fully account for. Field teams working the removal program logged wildfire smoke, sustained rain, wind, snow, sleet, lightning, and repeated low cloud cover that grounded aircraft for days at a stretch. Conditions documented in the program's own after-action reporting, not exaggerated for effect. Add to that a park where 95% of over 922,000 acres is designated wilderness. And the honest answer to how thorough any single survey can be is only as thorough as the weather allows, and the weather here rarely cooperates for long. Understanding exactly who runs this monitoring grid and why a goat photograph from 2025 ended up under this level of scrutiny matters before anything else about this file makes sense. The post-removal camera network is maintained by park wildlife staff in coordination with the same state and federal partners who ran the original operation, using stations placed specifically in drainages where capture crews reported partial coverage or where weather cut a scheduled sweep short. None of the biologists reviewing this footage came to the file looking for a story. The network exists because a program built on a population estimate, rather than a verified zero, needed a way to keep checking its own homework after the helicopters stopped flying. Several of the staff running this grid had worked the original capture and lethal removal operations themselves, which is part of why a single frame like this one gets checked as carefully as it does before anyone calls it more than routine. The Bailey Range Station itself was provisioned the way any post-program monitoring site is provisioned, mounted at a fixed height on exposed rock where no tree cover exists, angled across a known travel corridor between basins, synchronized to the same master clock running every other station on the grid, retrieved on a set rotation regardless of what the previous pull showed. The site was chosen specifically because it sits inside one of the sectors the original operation's own weather log marks as never fully swept. The station's prior 4 seasons had produced exactly what the program expected by 2025. Nothing. No goat sign, no confirmed animal. A quiet camera doing exactly what a successful removal program's monitoring equipment is supposed to do. That was the file's expected outcome, right up until this one frame. And nothing about the 4 seasons before it gave any reviewer reason to expect otherwise. The discovery wasn't made in the field. It surfaced during a routine seasonal review when a technician working through the pull noticed a nanny goat in daylight, checked the frame against the tagging log out of habit, and found no match. Not a misread tag, not a faded one, no tag at all, on an animal old enough that one should already exist in the file if she'd ever been in program hands. What the review eventually cataloged from that single frame amounts to its own inventory, built the same way any flagged capture on this grid gets built before anyone calls it unusual. The animal itself, adult female, horn growth consistent with at least 4 to 5 years of age, meaning she would have been alive and of capturable size during at least the final 2 of the program's 4 operational periods. The ear check. Both ears photographed clearly across 3 consecutive frames, neither showing a tag scar, or any sign one was ever removed. The program's own capture database, cross-referenced by park staff. No untagged release exception recorded anywhere in the Bailey Range or Mount Anderson operational area, across any of the 4 capture periods. The terrain log for the drainage, marked as partial coverage, weather limited, For 2 of the 4 capture periods, one of the few sectors on the peninsula never confirmed fully swept by either helicopter crew or ground team. The camera's own maintenance record, no gap in coverage across the 5 years separating the program's end and this frame, ruling out a simple missed retrieval window as the explanation for why nobody caught this animal sooner. And a check of the station's full season, not just the flagged frame, no second untagged animal, no kid trailing her. Nothing else in the surrounding weeks to suggest this was anything other than a single animal moving alone. And frames like this one, a single animal turning up outside a program's own paperwork years after that program declared its work finished, surface out of long-running monitoring archives more often than most people watching this would expect. Subscribing with notifications on is the only way to know when the next one gets reviewed and released. Now back to that basin below Mount Anderson. No new removal operation followed because a single untagged animal doesn't reopen a federal program on its own. What followed was a check of the 4 nearest monitoring stations across the surrounding drainages for any comparable capture. None of them logged an untagged adult in the same window, and a follow-up ground visit found no fresh sign of a second animal traveling with her. Whatever ground this animal has been using since at least 2020, the surrounding station suggests she's kept almost entirely to the one basin the removal crews themselves marked hardest to fully clear. The federal government's own position on this program is a matter of public record, and it does not claim what casual coverage of the removal often implies. The National Park Service's final reporting describes 412 goats removed against an estimated 2018 population of 725, with post-operation searches in the most difficult terrain turning up very few remaining animals or signs of them, language that stops well short of a confirmed 0 because the agency never had the visual coverage to claim one. No official document from this program asserts that every goat on the peninsula was accounted for, and none has walked back the caution built into that original language in the years since. That caution is why a monitoring network still exists 5 years after the last helicopter flight, staffed and funded on an ongoing basis rather than wound down once the final press release went out. It does not explain why this specific animal was never logged in any of the program's 4 operational periods in a drainage the program's own weather notes flag as incompletely surveyed. One point about this file requires complete transparency, stated exactly where it belongs and not folded into a footnote. Park staff involved in post-removal monitoring have described informally occasional sign in remote basins, tracks, bedding areas, browse damage to alpine plants that doesn't match any confirmed released or removed animal's known range. That pattern has never been compiled into a public report or officially confirmed as evidence of an unaccounted-for subpopulation. It exists as field observation shared between people who work this specific monitoring grid, and it deserves to be weighed exactly that way, not as an established finding. The reason that kind of observation stays informal rather than becoming a headline is straightforward. A program that spent 4 years and drew public criticism over its lethal removal methods has strong institutional reasons to be precise about what it claims to have finished, rather than reopening the question of how complete very few remaining actually was in the hardest sectors of the park. Public comment during the environmental review process was itself contentious enough that agency communications throughout the operation stayed carefully worded, and that same caution appears to extend to how any post-program anomaly gets discussed today. Attached to almost any other wildlife program, one untagged animal wouldn't warrant a second look. But this program already carried a documented pattern into the review. In 2018, the first capture period removed 98 of an estimated 725 goats, a fraction of the total population, in a single 2-week operation that the agency itself called only the opening phase. In 2019, 2 more capture periods brought the cumulative number translocated to 275, still short of the program's own stated goal of moving roughly half the estimated population before shifting to lethal methods. In 2020, a final capture round and then a ground-based lethal removal phase worked by 99 trained volunteers logging more than 9,000 hours between them brought the total removed to 412. And even then, the agency's own language described the remaining animals as few, not zero, specifically in the kind of terrain this camera sits in. A program that keeps revising its own completion estimate downward, drainage by drainage, on a documented 4-year rhythm, stops reading as a finished operation with a handful of loose ends. It starts reading like a survey that was always going to leave something standing in the hardest ground to reach, which is precisely the ground this camera has been watching since 2021. That pattern is not confined to the removal years. The same terrain that limited helicopter access during the operation is the same terrain drawing multiple independent monitoring efforts today. Carnivore researchers, tracking wolverines and lynx on overlapping grids elsewhere in the park, and at least one long-running, independently funded camera trap survey searching this same wilderness for undocumented large mammal activity of an entirely different kind. More cameras running longer in terrain this difficult to fully survey is itself part of why footage like this keeps surfacing from this specific peninsula more than from comparable wilderness elsewhere in North America. Wildlife removal programs elsewhere have run into the same gap between a population estimate and a confirmed zero. On several of California's Channel Islands, decades-long goat and pig eradication efforts were repeatedly declared complete, only for isolated holdout animals to turn up on camera or by direct sighting years afterward, forcing agencies to reopen operations they had already closed on paper and budgeted as finished. The architecture is the same: difficult terrain, a program built on an estimate rather than a full census, and an animal that simply outlasted the survey built to find it. Nothing that follows is established as fact. It is the only account this single frame, and the record around it actually support, and no more than that. One reading of the file places it like this: an animal already established in this basin before the program's helicopters ever reached this specific drainage. Surviving all 4 operational periods by staying in terrain weather kept crews out of on the days that mattered most. Moving between a narrow set of basins, never fully swept, undetected not through any unusual behavior, but through ordinary avoidance of exactly the kind of open, helicopter-accessible ground where every tagged animal in the program's database was caught in the first place. The physical record doesn't move once the alternate readings are set aside. An adult goat, old enough to have been present for at least 2 capture periods, with no tag scar, and no matching entry anywhere in the program's own database, photographed in a sector the program's own weather notes list as incompletely surveyed. None of it has been reconciled with the agency's own summary language describing the removal as effectively finished. This channel does not claim the Olympic Peninsula holds a hidden population of untagged goats, and it will not pretend the Park Service has made that claim either. One animal without a tag is not a second population, and a single frame is not a census. What the record shows is what the record shows, and where the record stops, this account stops with it. Files like this one, a federal program's own paperwork failing to account for something its own cameras eventually caught, surface out of long-running monitoring archives more often than most people expect, and most of them start exactly the way this one did, as a routine seasonal pull, flagged because a technician checked a tag log out of habit instead of skipping straight past the frame. If you know of a case that belongs in this archive, the comments are usually where it starts. The camera is still mounted on that same outcrop below Mount Anderson, running on the same rotation it always has. The next scheduled pull is this fall. The frame ends. The basin it's still watching was never fully counted to begin with, and the count is still technically open.